Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. Today is a continuation, a special overflow session for questions and answers that we did on Monday. The show is normally on Mondays. I'm not eager to name the questioners for several reasons. One of which is that I was born in 1944 when people didn't name themselves he who must be listened to, or the web guy that you never want to hear from, or, these cutesy names. That's one thing. And I don't think it's just when I was born. I think that you want to identify who you are. The other is that I might embarrass somebody with the questions, but with my answers to their questions. But I appreciate questions, particularly super chat questions. I don't get any of that money, unfortunately, but the ARCUK does, and they're a very deserving organization. So let's take them up in more or less the order they came in. First one is, what did the book The Logical Leap get wrong, in your view? This was a book that was in two parts. The first part, which was chapter 1, was the presentation of Leonard Peikoff's epical theory of the solution to the problem of induction. How can you go from some cats have tails to all cats have tails, or what? It's usually a more causal thing than that, although cats grow tails. And what about the fact that the Manx cat doesn't have a tail? But more interestingly, how do you go from, well, the moon works according to an inverse square law of the Newton discovered, and the tides are explained by that in the shape of the earth. But how do we know that everything is governed by the principle that matter attracts other matter with the force of inverse square from the distances to the centers of mass, or even just that all matter attracts other matter to make it? So how do we go from some that we've observed to all, including which we haven't observed? And Leonard Peikoff gave an incredible answer to that, way beyond what anybody else, including me, had ever begun to say. And it's absolutely right. The criticism I've heard of his theory, which I think is not valid, I mean, it has a point, but it's not a criticism of his theory, is that it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't give us the rules for how do we know when we've performed the proper induction and can claim certainty about an induction. Well, that wasn't the problem of induction. So chapter 1 of The Logical Leap, I think, is terrific, and I agree with it, and there's nothing wrong that I can recall, and I doubt there's anything wrong at all. Where I have heard criticisms, and I think there are errors, is in the second part of the book, which is chapters 2 through whatever, written by the author, not purporting to present Leonard Peikoff's theory, but the author's own understanding of the history of science. And I think he gets some things wrong, at least people who know the history of science better than I do, which isn't a hard state to achieve. I'm not that familiar with it. Say that there are errors in the presentation of the history, and that there's some forcing of the data to the theory, so to speak, which I pass along for what it's worth. I don't know, perhaps those sections are right and the people who are talking to me are wrong, but I don't think so, because these are experts in the history of philosophy. So chapter 1, the Leonard Peikoff theory, that's what you should endorse. Well, of course, you can't go by my say-so. Now, the next two go together. I'll read them both. There's one fundamental choice, and that is to live or not. Correct. Is there an objective reason why one should choose to live and not commit suicide? Is that choice subjective? Second question. Something I've always been confused by. We have to choose, act to live in order to remain in existence, but what does that decision rest on? There is some logical error I think I'm making. Thank you, Dr. Binswanger. So those are two questions asking about what is the reason for choosing to live? And the error, yes, there's a logical error of the stolen concept fallacy. The question is invalid. You can answer it in a sense, which I will in a minute. The whole point of Ayn Rand's proof of the ethics is that normative concepts like good, ought, right, should, wrong, bad, the opposite, rest upon the effects on life. So to ask, is there a reason why one should choose to live and not commit suicide is exactly like, it's out of place. It's a stolen concept. It's exactly like somebody saying, how many goals do you get in soccer for choosing to play a game of soccer? I can't see a soccer reason. I can't see a justification within soccer for playing soccer. No, of course not. Because soccer justifications are premised on you want to win a game of soccer. You're playing it and you want to win. In the same way, all evaluation, and that's the concept of filed this under, all application of values to judge something, all evaluation means how does this affect my life because I choose to live, and I need to know that. So if you're looking for a reason why you should choose to live, you're already presupposing that you choose to live. So it's like many of these things. What's the logical proof of the laws of logic? What reason is there to accept reason? What fact in existence makes us know that there is a fact of existence? There's certain, I was going to say axioms, but the choice to live is not an axiom. There's certain basic facts which give rise to certain concepts. So when you ask, what's the reason for, you're either asking, what is the evidence for based upon senses and logic? Or you're asking, why should I? In this case, it is why should I? And in that case, life is presupposed. In the first, existence, the senses and logic are presupposed. In the second, that you want to live is presupposed. Now, there is a sense, in a sense, a reason for choosing to live. And that is, it's enjoyable. Happiness. I want to be happy. I can't be happy, and I want to be happy. But that's not a moral reason to live. That's not a reason why you should. I'm just saying it's worth it. You'll be glad you did. But if that should not be the case, if you should be living with a terminal illness, God forbid, or God forbid, in permanent pain, I'm smiling while I'm saying God forbid. I don't really approve of that use of her fictional characters. But if you're living with cancer, let's say, that's incurable, and there's no prospect of a cure on the horizon, say it's 1930, and you got more and more pain, you should kill yourself, or rather, there's no shoulds that say you have to stay and suffer. So the only reason, in quotes, the only motive for living is that it's worth it. You will get enjoyment, you will get satisfaction, you will get the experience of yourself, which you like. Is that subjective? To continue with the concluding line of the first question, why should one choose to live and not commit suicide? Is that choice subjective? Look at the roots of your concept. Subjective is a distinction from objective. Since there is no objective evaluation outside of life, there's no contrast between objective and subjective. If you want to, if you choose to, you live. If you don't want to, you don't choose to live. That's not subjective. Subjective means there are facts, there are values, there are reasons, and you're playing soccer. There's a good move and a bad move, objective in the situation or not. But if you're not playing soccer, the soccer considerations don't apply. Now, the thing about that makes it not subjective, while you can't apply any negative concept to it, is there's no alternative for you. Death is the alternative, and death is not an alternative lifestyle. Death is non-action, non-values, non-choice, non-existence. So it's not like soccer. When you don't play soccer, you're doing other things. Just standing and breathing and taking in the scene is doing other things. But when you're dead, you're not doing something else. And then the question will be, well, why is living better than doing that other thing? It's values and evaluation based on life or nothing. Now, why is it that we're able to morally condemn people who are on the death premise, people who choose not to live for irrational, but because they irrationally don't look at the whole context and see that they could be, if they're young enough, happy? And what I mean by young enough, if they haven't committed 6 murders, and they have, enough of a basis to value things and achieve happiness. But if you're young enough and you choose not to live, if you have your life open to you, you're not dying of cancer, you just don't feel like it, that's immoral to choose to kill yourself arbitrarily like that. Why is it immoral? Everything I said implies I can't say it's immoral. And I can't really say it's immoral. But what I can say is I have chosen to live. And by the standards of life, which are the only standards they are, that's hideously bad. So I think the way that Dr. Peikoff puts it in OPAR, Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, if you don't know that acronym, the way he puts it is, you're a monster if you throw your life away. He can't really say you're evil, except by the standards of life which we have accepted. So we, who are not about to die, condemn you by our standards. And there are no others. The only standards for evaluation are the life-based standard. Life is a game that you cannot get out of. It won't be you who's on the other side of life. It'll be nothing. So that's a good question, and a question bearing discussion, and let me condense it down. All evaluation, all reasons why I should do this mean what's in it for me as a living being trying to stay alive? So to ask, well, why should there be a living being so I can kill myself, is to ask for something that in the nature of the thing is meaningless. What's a non-life-based evaluation? There is none. Can't be. And the other thing I said is there's a motive for living, and that's because it's worth it. You know, it's reported that when Ayn Rand first saw the first copy of Atlas Shrugged published in a Fifth Avenue bookstore, she said to the people that she was with, "It's worth it." And I think all of us have had those kind of moments where, yes, there's been a lot of bad times. Yes, there've been struggles. Yes, there's been a lot of effort, but it's worth it. Why do philosophers now write their papers in such hard and unreadable language? It is often the case that a paper says nothing, being 70 pages long. There's so many reasons that I wanted to get to the essential one. And I think the essential is philosophy has been severed from life. Philosophers, particularly the ones writing those papers, regard it as a game like soccer. And the way you score a goal is by recognition from your colleagues and advancement in the academic pecking order. And the only way that you can do that is to publish. And the more you publish, the better. And you don't want to be understood, because if you're understandable, it looks like you're simplistic, an anti-concept. I know a teacher, John Ridpath, who got an award for being a great teacher, and excellence in teaching was supposed to qualify you for tenure, but his department denied him tenure because they said he was a facile elucidator. And let me tell you, which meant he was too clear. When I wrote the first section of my dissertation, I gave it to my first reader at Columbia, and he didn't like the style. He said it was not good. The content he wasn't sure of, but the style he knew was not good. So on an inspiration, I wrote the next chapter without any editing. If a thought occurred to me, as it often did, in the middle of a sentence, I just put it in. I asked him what he thought of it stylistically. Much better, much better. So I learned from that, don't be clear if you want to get ahead in academia. Now, I will add that it's Immanuel Kant who launched this direction in philosophy. He was deliberately obscure because A, his thought was convoluted in the extreme, and B, he wanted to intimidate you into thinking he was deep. You know what Nietzsche said? We muddy the waters to make them look deep. So I'm reminded of the cartoon to answer you. Jesus is on the cross, and he's obviously just died. And there are two people at the foot of the cross, and one of them turns to the other and says, sure, he was a great teacher, but he didn't publish. And that's the way it is in academia. But fundamentally, they don't think they haven't got anything that a normal person would want to know. Mike Mazza, this next question said, did an interesting presentation at OCON about Freige's logic. And incidentally, there's no I in Frege, Frege. Some of Freige's updates were necessary to cover things missing in Aristotelian logic, but could there be a better version? I wouldn't say any of Freige's updates were necessary. The things that are missing from Aristotle's logic are things of not much importance for real people. They might be important in mathematics, but it's relations. It's things like the example I was given was heads of horses are parts of horses. So if you say he rode his horse, you can't get in, and therefore he rode something with a head or something like that. I can't, really reproduce it, but there are legitimate things having to do with the relations. Now, Henry Veach, familiar name? University of Indiana, a defender of Aristotelian logic. Henry Veach, Veatch, well worth reading. Claims that the attack on Aristotle here in his book, Intentional Logic, claims that the attacks are based upon a confusion between relations per se and specific kinds of relations. So for instance, you can in Aristotle's logic do this. A is bigger than B is bigger than C, so A is bigger than C. Now, you can't do that because that has to do, you need a premise. If one thing is bigger than another and the second is bigger than a third, then the first is bigger than the third. Or for short, size is transitive, is a transitive relation. But it's not true that all relations are transitive. For instance, John is loved by Mary. Am I going to be able to, let's make it simpler. Bill hit Bob. Bob hit Jim. That doesn't mean Bill hit Jim. And this comes up in very important ways, like Bob, who did I start with? Well, Bob can beat Bill at tennis. Bill can beat Frank at tennis. It does not follow that Bob can beat Frank at tennis. Doesn't follow at all. But that has to do with the specific nature of the relation. So I'm not convinced that there was needed an expansion of Aristotle's logic. But let's say that there was needed. Has there been an expansion that wasn't Freigean? Yes. A guy named Fred Summers, S-O-M, I believe one M, E-R-S, wrote a book on logic that offers a even symbolic logic that's Aristotelian. So yes, there are other ways of doing it. I don't think that's the real issue with Frege. The real issue with Frege has to do with the analytic-synthetic dichotomy and with rationalism/formalism. He was too close to Kant. But I think there's some value in Frege. At least I'm open to that idea. I don't think he's a big villain. Maybe a villain, but with redeeming features. If a right is a moral sanction, next question, and one has the right to do drugs and doing drugs is immoral, wouldn't mean that we have a moral right to immorality. Am I missing something? Yes. There's two things. A right is a moral sanction, not of the action, but of your being the one to decide it. Right is a moral sanction of a man's freedom of action in a social context. So there are many things that are not moral, which you have a right to do. Like speak out in favor of Kant, or go to church, or take drugs, which is pretty much the same thing as going to church. So the right says this is your choice for good or evil. You have this choice. No one can stop you from making it, because the principle before people choose to do right is that they are the choosers, or else someone makes them do what that person thinks they ought to do. So the choice to do X is more basic than doing X versus doing Y. Rights say each individual is the morally right person to make the choice in this area. I hope that one is clear, because that's absolutely essential. Now, sometimes it's phrased this way: do you have a right to do wrong? Do you have a right to do wrong? And in one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. Rights do not exist to protect taking drugs and going to church and all other kinds of blanking out. They exist in order that you can choose the moral thing. But in order to be free, to be able to choose the moral thing, you have to have the freedom to choose. So it's permissible if you explain it to say, well, a person has a right to be rude, or a person has a right to take drugs. Yes, because he has the right to choose between, concerning what he puts into his body, for instance, with drugs, or what philosophy he follows, if it's religion versus philosophy. All right, so I think that's very important. A question: is there a relationship between focus and lucid dreaming? Do you know what lucid dreaming is? It's dreaming in which, it's rare, dreaming in which the dreamer feels a sense of control and can make the plot go the way he wants it to go. It's a real phenomenon. I've certainly experienced it. Richard Feynman writes about it. It's nothing, bizarre or mystical. Enough of you, I think, is awake. It seems to control the imaginative process. It seems to happen just before waking up or just after falling asleep. So I assume that part of your brain and mind are still operative. I don't know, though. Is there a relationship between focus and lucid dreaming? Well, there's a relationship between focus and peanut butter. I don't mean to be nasty, but you can relate any two things in the universe. Is there a particular relationship between focus and dreaming? Well, what did you have to tell me what you have in mind. Would you discuss the transformation of sociobiology into evolutionary psychology? Yeah, it's just a name change. And the philosophic precursors to the evolutionary social sciences. Well, it's determinism. It's just genetic determinism. Sociobiology was begun by E.O. Wilson, who studied ants and tried to generalize to human beings in terms of how ants behave. And it's also based upon people who both of them are, this gets back to our first question. All of this has to do with hasty generalization, overgeneralization in contradiction of facts you know, not just arbitrary overgeneralization, where you go too far in a direction that there's no beyond which you don't reach a contradiction. Here you got the contradiction and you go on. Like, what are the contradictions? Determinism. If determinism were true, sociobiology as a discipline would be the behavior of sociobiologists or evolutionary psychologists under the influence of whatever influences them, not a branch of knowledge, not cognitive, not objective, not based on logic, but based upon some selection pressure. Now, suppose one of them says, yes, but selection pressures are selection. You're selected to be objective. How do you know that? That's just something, if you're determined, that you were made to believe. You can't know that it's natural selection or little demons like Descartes thought. Well, one big demon, he thought. You can't, if you say, my mind is run by something, now let me tell you what it is that runs it. You can't do that. My mind is run by something is equivalent to saying, everything I say has no relation to reality. Its cause is forced upon me. I'm reading a script that my genes or my parents or my church or something, I don't know what, made me read. So it's a hasty generalization in that it's the application of natural selection to where natural selection itself says it can't go. Natural selection requires that the results of the actions of the organism be heritable, be able to be passed on, but your moral status can't be passed on to someone else. Your decision to use your mind or not to use it does not flow through to your children. If it did, you couldn't, neither you nor your children could assert anything. And there were two other ways that it hasty generalized. One is the scope of natural selection. The other, I guess, is cause and effect being necessitated. Mechanical causality is necessary. If I drop a ball, it has to fall. It can't do anything other than it does. If it doesn't fall because it's interrupted by something, it has to be interrupted and not fall. But you don't have to think or evade when you do. That's your choice. So it's a extension of material causality to your consciousness, which is a very different phenomenon. And you should not be able to, you cannot assume that you can generalize from matter to consciousness, from the form of causality. And there was a third one, which I've forgotten, but what's the point? What is your view on adverse possession laws? Let me go wider. Just about everything in the English common law and the American system of government before World War I was right. The burden of proof is on someone. I mean, you should validate everything that you're going to be using and calling upon. But the burden of proof would be on the person who says, no, this aspect of the common law is wrong. Adverse possession is correct. Adverse possession, what is it? Suppose you have a piece of land of 150 acres in Kansas, and I'm your neighbor. And I have my own 200 acres abutting yours. There's a particular part of your land that I like to walk on. It's just 2 acres of the 150. In principle, it could be the whole thing, but I just want to make it plausible. So every day for 40 years, I have walked out onto this piece of land. You haven't stopped me. You haven't posted no trespassing sign. I put a little bench there, and then I put in a little barbecue, and I like to go out. And for 30 years, I've been barbecuing out there every weekend. You've done nothing to stop me. Well, after a while, that it's objectively clear you've abandoned that property. That's what adverse possession is. I can now file after sufficient period of time, and the minimum I've read about is 10 years, but that may be too little. You can file, this is really my land, because property rights come from use. And what you're saying is the owner has permitted this. So he's abandoned his rights to that. Now the owner gets a chance to appeal. So it's not like it's just yanked out from under someone. And in most cases, either the owner cannot be contacted because it has been abandoned and it's reverted to the unknown state, or the owner says, well, all right, I mean, he's been using it my whole lifetime. I don't care. I didn't even know it was on my land. Or maybe he wants to reserve mineral rights or something. As long he can have it as long as X, and then they make a contract. So it's the objectivity of use that governs ownership. If you give a rational man reason to think you've abandoned your right to something, then he may go to court and claim ownership. It's reverted to, if the court decides that he has abandoned it, the evidence is there, then it's yours. It's like, I found a $20 bill on the streets of Manhattan back when that was real money. It was about 3 a.m, and I was riding my moped, as I recall. And I looked down, and there's a $20 bill. I stopped and picked it up, and it's in the middle of, it was 3rd Avenue. And it's 3 a.m. There's no way I could possibly determine who owned this bill. And I'm not going to post somewhere, did you lose a $20 bill? So it's abandoned. It's probably unintentionally abandoned, but at that point it's unowned. So I kept it. That's correct. The other questions I think were postponed. I'll tell you what they are. What do you make of the rise of anti-Semitism? And where can I read about the event-to-event view of causality, which Objectivism rejects? Here's one that have just been added. Objectivists say that only individual human beings have a right to life. Would it follow that Siamese twins don't have a right to life? That's a great example of a bad question. And I want to say why it's a bad question. I think everybody senses that it's a bad question. There's a particular fallacy known to Aristotle that this exhibits, and we'll talk about that the next time I have a question period. So thanks for coming to this overflow period. We've covered most of them. See you on Monday.